Let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to be talking, of course, today about brain health and about memory and what we can do to really support memory and reduce dementia. And as we go through this talk today, we've got a ton of information. So please make sure that if you have a question that comes up, put it in the chat. And that allows Dr. Mary and I to really go over those questions in a meaningful way. And that way we don't forget anything or have it get lost as we're going through a whole bunch of info for you today. So make sure to put it in the chat and we'll make sure to circle back to that at the end. And we really want to make sure that these talks are useful to you. So that's one way that we can make sure that you're part of our conversation. And we always tend to kind of overpack these talks with so much, so much information. And hopefully that way you guys can feel like if you have questions that are relevant, that they're answered. So I'm Dr. Molly Force. I'm the clinical director here at Prosper Natural Health, and I'm joined today by Dr. Mary, who is joining us all the way from New York. And we also have wonderful Dr. Rosalie. Now, she just had her baby this week, which is just so exciting. So we are just celebrating for her and holding space for her and her family as she expands it. And she'll be joining us back in the early fall. But for right now, she's just focusing in on her kiddo. So what we do at Prosper is a little bit different than at conventional clinics. We really value a team care approach to our patient care. And what that allows us to do is, because we're coming into our patient interactions from a naturopathic perspective, we like to be able to chat amongst ourselves and really figure out what the best path forward for a patient might be. And sometimes we are using modalities from a more Western approach in the natural sphere, or sometimes we're using more Eastern approaches. And Dr. Rosalie comes with an Ayurvedic background, and Dr. Mary has a background in traditional Chinese medicine and actually practices acupuncture as well as being a naturopath. So we love being able to blend these different modalities and really find what's going to work best for our patients. And it's been such a learning journey for me as a physician as well. And it's just been such a treat. So today we're going to talk about brain health, and we're going to be talking about specifically about ways to preserve memory. And when we were creating this talk, we wanted to make sure that we were really clear with our goals as naturopathic physicians with you guys. So the number one goal for us is to really preserve memory function. So that, of course, means to stop any further loss that might be coming down the tracks as things progress for patients. Number two is we want to manage symptoms. We recognize that a disruption in brain health and a disruption in memory can cause all kinds of challenges for day-to-day activities, and also can really lead patients into having changes in their mood. Specifically, we see anxiety and depression crop up for people, and we want to make sure that our patients have really beautiful strategies that they and their families can put in place to really help them manage the symptoms where they are today. And then, of course, we want to be engaging in this third tier, which is the brain healing and the rehabilitation. And one of the beautiful aspects of the brain is that we have this concept of plasticity. What that means is the brain can adapt and change, and new neural networks can be initiated and rerouting can occur. And that is a beautiful thing when we're talking about healing the brain, and especially for something that can be so central to somebody's quality of life and their experience here on the planet. So one of the beautiful components of our approach as naturopaths is we get to kind of think outside the box a little bit. We're not just really rigidly stuck to certain pharmaceuticals. Of course, when pharmaceuticals are necessary, they're wonderful tools, but we want to think further outside the box and think about the physiology that's involving brain health and what we can do to really support the brain as a functional organ. So that's where the really cool stuff comes in and the really gratifying stuff as clinicians comes in. So we're going to go through our different strategies today. But before we do, of course, we want to talk about what normal brain function is and what the different regions of the brain are generally supposed to be engaging in. Now, this gets very complex. So we've broke it down into these 4 categories for you guys, just so we have the same tools when we're talking about these today. We have this working memory, and that's really happening in this frontal area of our brain and on these parietal lobes that are just this frontal and lateral area of the sides of our brains. And these are, of course, what's going to hold the information that we need to accomplish complex tasks. So we really see that coming into play when somebody is trying to accomplish something that they're trying to do, a task. So I see this very much in my little kiddos, where I'll say, okay, now go get your shoes on. And they have to remember how to go and find their shoes and put them on and all the steps it involves in pulling those shoes on, taking the tongue of their shoes out and getting them fitted on correctly. So that's the working memory. We next have the declarative memory, and that's really in this medial temporal lobe, and that's more on the side here of our brain. And that's going to be what helps, those are the memories that really help us recall facts. So that's a really important one whenever we're trying to have a discussion with others and whenever we're trying to rationalize things. The next type of memory we're going to be discussing today is procedural memory, and that happens back in the cerebellum. And these are ones that are involved in our unconscious skills. So the things that we know how to do at this point unconsciously have been stored back here in this cerebellum. We also have our short-term memory, and that's found in the hippocampus, which is kind of closer to that midbrain area. So if we were to cross-section our brain right in the center. So, and this information is so critical because it's what's held actively for us to recall a short period of time, what's just recently happened. So we want to make sure, of course, that all of these are functioning in concert with each other. And if you're starting to notice a shift in any of these types of memory, it's important to bring up with your clinician. And that's another big piece we want to share with you guys today. Sometimes patients really chalk things up to aging. Oh, this is just the aging brain, or yeah, this has been happening, but I mentioned it and it kind of got glossed over. Well, the brain can be very complex, but we do not want to gloss over shifts and changes. They can be very important signals and signs from our body. So some of those signs that really start to crop up are little forgetful moments, like forgetting certain dates and events, missing appointments, those kind of things. Sometimes we see people start to experiencing challenges with their planning. Don't judge us for having the wrong date there on that Zoom meeting today. Sorry about that, guys. But in all seriousness, we start to see these changes with planning, with problem solving, finding it harder to do these basic tasks that we've done maybe for years, familiar tasks at home, forgetting to complete certain tasks, turning off the oven, those kind of things. Sometimes we start to see confusion with where we are at a certain time or place, and that can be quite alarming for people. Of course, anytime there's a difficulty understanding what visual information we're taking in or spatial relationships, perhaps bumping ourselves as we're walking through doorways, things like that, that can be a really important sign of a shift. Difficulty with word recall is one that comes up quite a bit. That can be spoken or written. And then also finding that you're misplacing things. Maybe you've had a routine where things have been placed for a long period of time, and all of a sudden those keys are not showing up or those glasses are not showing up. Poor judgment. So changes in judgment with how you would normally be going about your decision making can of course be a big sign that we want to pay attention to. And then that shift in withdrawing within to oneself, signs that there are changes with wanting to socialize, wanting to engage with others. And then of course, if we're starting to see mood or personality changes, this can be a really important sign for us that there are neurochemical or brain changes that are occurring. So we want to pay attention to all of those. So Dr. Mary is going to talk to us more about how things start to shift for the brain.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Molly. So next, we're going to go into some of the major causes of neurodegenerative disease and some of the major kind of categories. And first here, I want to make a distinction between what we refer to as neurodegeneration and then neurodegenerative disease. So with neurodegeneration, this is a loss of neurons or connectivity of the regions of the brain. And these are often occurring secondary to other underlying causes. And these are often functional and reversible once you remove the underlying insult or deficit. So within this category, we have many things that can contribute to neurodegeneration, and that includes hypothyroidism, so low thyroid hormone causing brain degeneration over time. We've got nutrient deficiencies like B12 deficiency causing dementia. Traumatic brain injuries can lead to some pretty significant immune responses and brain damage that can cause neurodegeneration. We've got alcohol and drug abuse, dementia, hormone deficiencies, so often low estrogen and low testosterone, anemia or low iron, where your iron's too low, and iron is what actually carries oxygen around the body. So if you don't have enough oxygen or enough iron to carry that, to produce the hemoglobin that carries the oxygen, we're not getting enough oxygen to the brain, and that can cause brain deterioration over time. We also have sleep disorders. We know that sleep it plays a major role in brain function, and we'll discuss that more later in the talk. Respiratory issues, and again, low oxygenation can play a role. And then we have post-viral syndrome. So this happens when you have an exposure to a virus and have a significant response, and we can have resulting long-term damage that can occur. And the one that has been on our minds recently is post-COVID syndrome. So that can affect the inflammatory response when you have the virus, can cause cell damage in the brain that can affect brain function over time. So next we have neurodegenerative disease. So this is referring to these different disease processes where there's an actual structural change to the brain, and it can cause these lasting changes to brain structures that affect cognition. So the most common ones are Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies. So aside from vascular dementia, all of these other ones are one of the, we're still understanding, scientists are really still getting to the bottom of what causes these dementias, but one of the major drivers of the structural change with these dementias are changes in protein folding in the brain. So there's all of these proteins that create the brain cells, And when they start to have these conformational changes, it's like you have an electric wire that gets so wrapped up and tangled that it doesn't function to transmit that signal anymore. So that's what's happening in a lot of these dementias mentioned over to the right. So with Alzheimer's, we see changes in what we call tau proteins, where they form tangles um, within the cells. And then we have beta amyloid plaques, which are another type of protein that changes conformation and causes these kind of sheets of material that can interfere with brain function. And with Alzheimer's, we see 7 stages of progression. So we can go from completely asymptomatic to severe loss of cognitive function and severe physiological changes. And then we have vascular dementia. This often happens after a stroke or when there's a blood clot that lodges in a blood vessel and causes a lack of blood flow to one part of the brain. And that can result in significant brain damage and significant loss of function, usually on the other side of the body from where the what we call an infarct happens. And this can be something where we know that a stroke happened and someone loses function, like someone has neurological deficits like weakness on one side of their body. And it can often happen in silent ways. So there can be many, many strokes that someone experiences and they never knew that they had a stroke, but then they'll start to lose brain function over time. The third most common form of dementia is frontotemporal dementia. This often, one of the key signs and symptoms of this is changes in behavior and personality. And then we'll often see difficulty with speaking or word comprehension. And then lastly, we've got dementia with Lewy bodies. And this one starts with a cognitive decline and then often progresses to changes with movement. So you'll see rigidity, decreased facial muscle expression, and a decreased arm swing. Okay. So there's a number of different memory loss types, and the symptoms of these dementias can be grouped into 3 major categories. One is more dementia and cognitive decline that we kind of think of more readily when we're talking about dementia. And so this involves forgetting recently learned information, forgetting dates, events, and appointments, losing objects and forgetting where you place them, and sometimes memory lapses in the middle of conversation, like you're in the middle of conversation and suddenly you can't remember someone's name, or you kind of forget what you were talking about. We also see what we call Parkinsonism. So this is changes in movement, and it can sometimes be increased movement, so a tremor where you have this kind of shake. But then you also can have stiffness and slowed movement. So this can often affect the gut nervous system and cause constipation, and it can affect our sense of taste and smell. And one of the main signs is someone will just have decreased facial expression because their facial muscles are not functioning properly. And then lastly, we have cerebellar degeneration. So the cerebellum is the part of our brain that controls balance and a number of basic functions. And what we'll see with damage to the cerebellum, which is in the back of the brain, is worsened balance and coordination. And often people will be feeling dizzy and disoriented and bumping into things. So with all of these dementias, all these dementia types, one of the main and most concerning symptoms is depression and decreased brain endurance. And, with aging, we often see decreased brain endurance and and so often when people present to primary care with depression and decreased brain endurance, it can be chalked up to aging, but it is something to always keep in mind that you want to make sure that there's not an underlying process at play that we need to address. All right, so next I'm going to discuss the role of inflammation in the Alzheimer's disease process. And in explaining this, so inflammation plays a role in all neural degeneration. And I just want to explain what we mean when we say neural inflammation, because we're going to discuss how we reduce inflammation later on in the lecture. And I want you to understand why it's important. So, as I was mentioning before, with Alzheimer's disease, we see these tau proteins and beta amyloid plaques forming. And there's a genetic component that is involved in their formation, but there's a number of other triggers that we have more kind of control over changing. So environmental influences, and then lifestyle, and then exposure to pathogens can all be triggers for this formation of the change in the protein structures of the brain. And then so what can happen in response to these change in protein structures is the body says, what are these weird conformational proteins? We do not recognize them. We're going to mount a response to them. So this can often, then the immune system is activated, and we have a number of these pro-inflammatory messengers like cytokines and chemokines. And this can lead to a lot of oxidative stress, which can then lead to cell damage and cell death. And then that cell damage and cell death can cause a further inflammatory response. So you can create this cycle of inflammation that can worsen cognitive decline. So the reason this is important is because again, like I was saying, there's some things we can change and some things we can't. And later on in the lecture, we're going to discuss our lifestyle strategies that we can change over time, and how to reduce our systemic inflammatory load through removing causes of systemic inflammation, and then reducing inflammation with supplements and diet and lifestyle. So this is good for you to understand how it all plays together and how we need these kind of long-term strategies in place to affect this disease process. All right, so there are a number of contributing or potential contributing factors to neural inflammation, and these are all going to be specific to the individual. But when we see that there's a cognitive decline, often we want to look for these underlying causes that are contributing to neural and systemic inflammation. And some of them are going to be pathogens, so viral infections and bacterial infections that can be long-term that we want to address. Heavy metals can play a huge role in neural inflammation, particularly when they're able to get into the brain. And then trauma events, so concussions and post-concussive syndrome can be a huge contributor. And interestingly, gut health, even though it's very far from the brain and we don't always think of it as being directly connected, there's these really well-known routes of communication between the gut and the brain. And that happens via the immune system, via these main nerves called the vagus nerve, which is kind of a main highway that connects the gut to the brain. And then many different hormone and inflammatory signals that by where the gut communicates with the brain. And so we see that the health of the microbiome, so all of the bacteria and viruses that we have a mutualistic relationship with that exist in our gut, the health of that environment and that ecosystem can play a huge role in cognition and cognitive decline. via all of those highways of information I was just describing. And then often we see gluten sensitivity and celiac disease playing a role in brain health over time. So it's not just affecting gut function, but affecting our cognitive function as well. And then lastly, we have this structure called the blood-brain barrier that's really important for, so we'll go to the next slide and I'll show you a picture of it and describe and explain why it's important. So the blood-brain barrier is it's made up of these structures that there's these helper cells called glial cells that they have all these feet that form this barrier between our blood vessels, so our vascular system, and the rest of our brain. And the reason this is important is because brain tissue is very sensitive to lots of different kinds of damage, including oxidative damage. And it's tissue that, as you can imagine, we really want to keep safe and separate from our systemic circulation. Because when you have things like heavy metals and viral infections and all of these things that can cause damage to cells, you want to prevent that from influencing brain tissue. So the blood-brain barrier performs that function of keeping all of those insults out. And we see that with an inflammatory event, like for instance, a concussion and a traumatic brain injury, often will have blood-brain barrier compromise. So the tight junctions are not there, and they'll form a decreased protection system. This can allow those viruses and bacteria and heavy metals and toxins to more easily access brain tissue and further an inflammatory response and worsen dementia and neural aging. So later on in the talk, we'll discuss how to maintain this blood-brain barrier and why it's important.
Thank you, Dr. Mary. There's a lot of really good information about what can happen as far as triggers that can go wrong. So as naturopaths, one of our first things that we're trying to figure out is the root cause. So what's going wrong? Is there a structural component that's affected? Are we looking at a signaling issue? Are we looking at inflammatory response? So we want to identify that and really figure out how to stop that that damage from continuing. So our next step is really to reduce the things that are contributing, especially if we have neural inflammation, because often once damage starts, we have this signaling for the neural inflammation to start, and turning that off is very, very challenging. And the body is wise and tries to sequester it, but as it does that, damage can be done in those certain areas of the brain. So then we're also, of course, looking for these long-term strategies to really support the brain health and that rehabilitation of the brain. So when we're looking at evaluating our patients, believe it or not, that evaluation starts even before the patient shows up for their first visit. It actually starts with our staff, when our staff is making that appointment. A lot of times we are really asking our staff, like, how did that go? You know, making that appointment. Were there a lot of questions? Was there a lot of confusion about establishing the appointment time, those kind of things? And how did it go as far as like doing the intake forms and stuff like that? When you are thinking about yourself, the first thing you can start to do is look at what's going on for you in your daily life in regards to completing tasks, in regards to your mental emotional state. Thinking about if there have been emotional shifts for you that might be significant, or physical things that have happened to you, whether or not you've had recent viral responses, say from COVID or something else, or if you have had a concussion that might be coming into play, because that can start a neural inflammatory event, even that happened 10 or 20 years ago. So think about that first and know that when we're assessing, we are starting way before the patient comes in. And then when we see the patient's intake, that also gives us a lot of information. Now, it used to be that everything was handwritten. So there were even clues for us as practitioners when we would see people's handwriting. We also now, we have all these digital intake questionnaires. Well, that can be really confusing to get through and complete. So if somebody comes in and tells us, "Oh, that was just impossible," that can be a clue for us if they're experiencing memory changes or mood changes. And we also, of course, have very specific questionnaires that we can give out, and we'll talk about that in a second, to assess mental status. And whenever we're observing patients, that also can tell us quite a bit about what's going on for them, whether or not they're having challenges with recall, or like word recall or event recall, those kind of things, of course. And if they're having a challenge with their emotional state, that can be informational, of course, as well. There are also computerized testing that some clinicians use to do cognitive tests as well. I wanted to just share with you guys the most common intake forms that are given to assess brain health. There are two forms. There is this mental mini, so the mini mental status exam, this MMSE over here, and then there's the MOCA exam. And these are two different intake forms, basically, that the patient fills out, and the clinician then scores them on how well they completed these tests. Now, the MOCA is something that you have to have a certified practitioner complete, and that's changed just in the last few years here. But the MMSC is something that can be used by just about any practitioner to figure out how a person's cognition might be today and how it might be changing. So it's nice to get as a starting point for a patient that's starting to experience changes, or also to get as a check-in about severity of symptoms for people who've been having more issues. As far as in-office testing, there's physical exam that can be done that can be really helpful, especially if we're worried about cerebellar components. We're looking at how people are moving, if there are tremors involved, if there are changes in their face as far as how they are expressing, those kind of things. And then there are also some smell tests, and I just found this really interesting. And it's actually a clinical tool that we use here. So we see that different smells start to be decreased, the ability to smell. So it's called the sniff test, certain smells with these different classifications of neural changes. So with Alzheimer's, we see the lack of the ability to smell and distinguish peanut butter. And in Parkinson's patients, we see that peppermint, coffee, and anise, which smells kind of like fennel, those have declined in those patients. So that's something that we can use to test just to give us more information. Dr. Mary, you want to talk about lab samples?
All right, so next we're going to talk about some ways that we can evaluate the underlying causes of cognitive decline using different labs. And so the main ones that we use at Prosper are blood panels. And so we'll often start with a a panel including a complete blood count where we can look for any signs of anemia or infection that can be contributing to neural inflammation and that decreased oxygenation I was discussing earlier. We can also look at iron levels and ferritin more directly to see what iron stores are, what your iron stores are. There's markers such as homocysteine and high sensitivity CRP, whereby we can look at inflammation into systemic inflammation and vascular inflammation to see how much that is contributing. Hemoglobin A1C and glucose are really big and something that we always want to have included in an initial evaluation. And that's because blood sugar regulation can play a huge role in the maintenance or decline of brain function. We'll discuss that more later. And then we want to look at lipids. So our lipids are going to kind of give us a sense of our vascular health and can contribute to vascular disease and can cause decreased blood flow to the brain via plaquing, often in the carotid arteries. So there's one set of testing called the Cyrex Alzheimer's Array that uses really cool novel technology. And it's actually using antibodies. So rather than looking at, levels of hormones or levels of iron, for instance, in the blood, we're looking at our immune system's response to certain proteins and certain pathogens. So it's a really wonderful way to get a functional look at how our bodies are responding to these proteins and pathogens that can influence Alzheimer's disease progression specifically. And this particular test looks at the way these antibodies are interacting with the tau proteins and amyloid beta plaques that I was discussing before. And it also looks at a number of functional markers like reactions to specific bacteria and reactions to specific chemicals. So really cool cutting edge way to assess how to support you from a functional medicine perspective. We also do a good amount of hormone testing. So looking at sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone that can play a huge role in brain health. And then looking at thyroid function. So whether or not thyroid over functioning or under functioning is affecting your cognitive capacity. We'll look at vitamins and minerals. So B12 was one major one I was discussing before. These are often involved in the production of our neurotransmitters and can play a big role in basic neurological functioning. Heavy metal testing can be really useful to see if heavy metals are causing any insult to brain tissue. And then lastly, we can do an omega check, and that is looking at your balance of the omega-3 and omega-9 and omega-6 fatty acids. And that tells us a lot about about predicting our systemic inflammatory response and kind of gives us a way to change our diet to overall reduce inflammation in our bodies. All right, so here, this is just kind of an explanation of how we're evaluating iron storage. Again, iron is important in transporting oxygen around the body and specifically to the brain. So we always want to look out for fatigue, easy bruising, shortness of breath, and difficulty thinking as signs of anemia. That'll signal that you should get some blood work to look at your complete blood count and ferritin and iron. to see if that is contributing to your disease process. Okay, and then so next next I'm going to talk about evaluating hormones. The testing that I prefer for hormone evaluation is typically salivary testing. This testing is great because it's testing what's active in the tissues, and that can often differ a lot from what is present in our blood. Through these salivary hormone tests, we can look at progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, and DHEA levels. And this can really give us a sense of your hormone stores over time, particularly with postmenopausal women and also aging in men, where we'll see changes in brain function with changes in our sex steroid hormones. And it's a great way for us to evaluate whether or not we want to change anything about the hormone balance to support your brain function in that way. And then lastly, we have some imaging and nerve conduction testing. This is often going to be done through a neurologist, and it's used to assess damage in the brain. So often part of a complete workup when you're trying to assess whether or not any change in your brain function and cognitive capacity is due to Alzheimer's, dementia, or any underlying damage that may have occurred, for instance, with the vascular dementia that I was discussing before. So our brain CTs and brain MRIs are going to give us really specific information on any structural damage that may have occurred in the brain. And then EEGs allow us to look at brain connectivity and the actual neurological brain waves that are happening. And the classic thing that it helps us evaluate for is epilepsy. And there's some interesting new ways that people are using it for functional assessments. But so these are all kind of advanced testing that you may get with a in-depth workup. All right, so next I'm going to pass this back to Dr. Molly, who's going to start us off with our treatment section.
And before I do, I just want to mention that the one piece here that Dr. Mary and I, did not address as far as the evaluation is how do you evaluate your inflammation that's happening actively in the brain? And the reason that that's wasn't put on there is because at this point we don't have any imaging or studies that directly tell us how much glial cell activation and inflammation we have going on. The only way we know about that for patients would be post-mortem, an autopsy, which is pretty unfortunate to not be able to know about that, while folks are with us and alive here. So what that means is when people have inflammation showing up in as far as signs and symptoms, and we know that it can cause such drastic changes for them as far as their neurologic function goes, we do really want to start engaging in those anti-inflammatory activities in regards to diet and lifestyle, etc., that we're going to get into here. So we just wanted to make sure that that was really clear for people, because it's an unfortunate thing that our MRIs can't show that. It's such small structures in the brain that are being affected, but they are being affected quite drastically a lot of times with that inflammation. So we want to talk about ways to preserve memory, right? So, and ways to enhance the function. So with this, as good naturopathic physicians, we're taking a multi-system approach. So of course we want to start with our foundational pieces. So Are our patients hydrated? Are they getting the proper nutrition? That means that we have these anti-inflammatory, good quality nutrients coming in, proper mineral balance, proper antioxidants to help reduce free radical damage that could be feeding into a pro-inflammatory cycle that could be doing damage. We want to make sure that sugars, blood sugars, are really well balanced and balanced well with fats, because fats are a really critical base material for our brain that we need. And then we want to also make sure that we have proper probiotics, of course, because we talked about that gut-brain axis and that information that's shared along that line and how impactful that can be. Of course, we want to make sure that movement and exercise are on board, that our patients are getting their proper rest and sleep, and that stress is managed, because we know that that can be so impactful. Now, hormone balance, we've mentioned. We often are thinking about our balance between our cortisol, our wake hormone, and our melatonin, our sleep hormone. We're thinking about the balance between the estrogens, progesterones, testosterone, and DHEA for our patients. And we want to make sure that those hormones are balanced and working in concert with each other, and as well as the thyroid hormones working well there too. And then, of course, our antioxidants, they kind of stand alone as their own piece, because they help mitigate damage that's already affecting the brain. So let's talk about some of the basic fuels that your brain really needs to function. Because without these basic pieces, we have dysregulation and we have further damage happening. So we want to think first about, are we having proper blood flow? So is there cardiovascular disease or some concern there as far as a decreased ability for the vascularization to oxygenate those brain tissues? So how is blood flow? If you're having blood flow issues in other areas like hypertension for your body, then that could be affecting your brain. And in fact, you could be having these silent infarcts. So what that means, that fancy word basically means not enough oxygen causing tissue damage in certain regions of the brain. And they're essentially like mini strokes that happen. And we know that hypertension, high blood pressure, puts us at very great risk of these silent infarcts. So it means that you might not have symptoms from it, but you could be having these brain damaging events that are happening. So we want to make sure we're controlling blood pressure, we're controlling vascular flow, and allowing there to be good flow, if you will, all the way up to the brain and out to those peripheral tissues. Now, glucose is our next one. We want to make sure that those sugars are well regulated. We don't want hypoglycemia. Our brain uses those sugars for energy. So we want to make sure that our blood sugar is nice and stable, and we're going to get really nitty gritty about that here in a minute with you guys. So think about that. If you have periods of time in the day that maybe you have to skip a meal or space things out further than you should, or maybe you had something sugary and then you fell off that glycemic roller coaster and you're hypoglycemic, that's going to affect your cognitive function. It's going to affect your mood too, almost a guarantee. Now, oxygen is so critical for brain tissue. It is a must. So we think about anemia. That's why we had a secondary slide just all about anemia and how important it is to evaluate. So if you're walking around with chronic anemia, that's going to affect your cognitive function. And without getting that corrected, it makes it very challenging for us to address cognitive changes and mood, and really get your brain functioning as well as it should. Smoking depletes that oxygenation. We know that smoking causes cigarettes and tobacco cause a vasoconstriction. When that vasoconstriction happens, we have about 7 minutes after that intake of the cigarette that we have this vasoconstrictive activity, and we have reduced blood flow to the brain. That's a problem for us. And then we also, of course, want to be thinking about that blood flow disorder. And we talked about that earlier when we were thinking about cardiovascular issues. Hormones are going to make a big difference as far as brain function. They are chemical signalers. So they tell things to turn on and turn off, and what volume to turn them on to or to dampen them down. So we want to make sure that those hormones are nice and balanced. And then amino acids, they're going to be also our building block proteins for our signals and our neurotransmitters. So, Dr. Mary, you want to jump back in here? We're kind of trading off quickly here without Dr. Rosalie here today. So, thanks for sticking with us, guys.
Yeah, all right. So next we're going to discuss the blood sugar roller coaster. So as Dr. Molly was explaining, glucose is a major fuel for our brain, and it's the thing that our brain cells are able to actually use to promote cellular function. And so if you can imagine a roller coaster where you're kind of going up to these really high peaks and then going all the way down really quickly, um, that's what will happen with the when your blood sugar is dysregulated. So rather than having a steady influx of glucose that is released into your bloodstream in a kind of controlled manner, and then having that fuel, that brain fuel readily available, we're seeing this spike in blood sugar and then rapid decline, leaving us with times where we have less than optimal fuel for our brain. So, what will happen with the blood sugar roller coaster is often you'll see someone have a high sugar or carb meal, and that will cause a rapid increase in glucose in the blood. This will cause insulin to be released from the pancreas to then signal to the body to lower blood sugar. Um, then we have a rapid decrease in the availability of glucose for our cells. This can cause an adrenal gland response and release of epinephrine, which then increases blood sugar. And then over time, you can see that the adrenal glands will be exhausted with repeated stress. And over time, they'll stop functioning. And this is causing this kind of reactive low blood sugar events. And then when you're feeling fatigued and exhausted, what do you want to eat is something high in sugar, like a donut or something that'll kind of give you quick fuel. So often this will kind of lead people to have more sugar in their diet, and this will cause this whole process of the blood sugar roller coaster to perpetuate. So blood sugar stability plays a huge role in cognitive function. We see about 60 to 70% of people with diabetes have nervous system damage. So you'll see that with the peripheral neuropathies, where you have numbness and tingling in the feet and hands, vision changes, changes to the digestive nervous system. And we know that insulin can have a major influence on our neurotransmitters. We'll see a risk of stroke increasing by 2 to 4 times with folks with diabetes, predisposing people to that vascular dementia that I was discussing before. And then there's some newer research that's come out since around 2020 that where people are kind of really making connections between blood sugar dysregulation and Alzheimer's, to the extent that many clinicians are calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. So huge connection, and the blood sugar stability is a really important piece to pay attention to over time. So some strategies to lower blood sugar are going to include a low glycemic diet. You can find these lists of low glycemic foods, but what a low glycemic food is a food that does not cause a drastic spike in your blood sugar after you eat it. So for instance, something like, table sugar or a donut will cause that kind of quick influx of refined sugar will be rapidly absorbed into your bloodstream and cause a blood sugar spike, versus something like avocado or peanut butter has a lot of fat and protein in it, and it will first of all slow the digestion within your of those nutrients within your digestive tract, and it will lead to a more sustained release of glucose into your bloodstream over time. Exercise can play a major role in blood sugar regulation. One of the kind of most simple ways to affect your blood sugar is what we call cakewalks, where you go for a 10 to 15-minute walk around the block or in your neighborhood after a meal. And while it's ideal to really get, a good 45 minutes of cardiovascular um, exercise throughout the day, um, just those simple walks will make a huge impact in your blood sugar regulation, especially after a high glucose or high refined sugar or refined carbohydrate meal. Um, we also want to pay attention to the adrenal system. So when we have our stress hormones released, like cortisol and epinephrine, those stress hormones signal to our bodies to release blood sugar into our bloodstream, or release glucose into our bloodstream. So you can imagine how that would be useful if you're running away from a bear, to have this quick fuel source, right? So your stress hormones are causing that quick release of glucose. But over time, when we're not actually running away from a bear and we're not actually using those fuels, we're just sitting at our desk, that can lead to that blood sugar roller coaster that I was discussing before. So adrenal support in the form of relaxation techniques or in the form of these adaptogenic herbs that we'll discuss later can be really important. And so there's a number of other herbs and nutrients and pharmaceuticals that can affect blood sugar. And those are ones that we'll get into more specifically with patients depending on their blood sugar control needs. Okay, so I described the glycemic index before. This just goes into it in a little more depth. So the glycemic index measures the rise of blood sugar after eating a particular food, and it's on a scale of 0 to 100. And so some of the rules of thumb are high fat and protein foods have lower glycemic indexes, and higher fiber foods have lower glycemic indexes. And so you always want to look at the refined carbohydrate content or just the carbohydrate content of a food. So for instance, potatoes, even though they're, a vegetable, are very high glycemic index. And so when we're trying to slow the release of blood sugar into the bloodstream, we want to increase proteins, we want to increase fat, and we want to increase fiber. Those are all going to slow the absorption of those sugars. And so we can do that often by pairing any high carbohydrate snack with a high protein and high fat content food. So for instance, if you're having a piece of toast, adding some peanut butter, adding some avocado to it can be really helpful. All right, so here we're just going to dive into a little bit more about diet to control blood sugar. So again, we want to focus on foods that are low in the glycemic index. You want to have small, frequent meals versus a giant meal where you're absorbing it all at once. Really focus on healthy sources of proteins like meats, fish, shellfish, nuts, and eggs, and then healthy sources of fats like seeds and nuts and whole dairy and avocado, and certain oils like sesame oil and olive oil. Again, we want to limit carbohydrates like grains and flour and refined sugar, and avoid most sweeteners. Really want to make sure we're getting fiber in with every meal, aiming for 30 grams a day. And just really, when you are craving a sugary snack, going for sugars that are paired with fiber, like fruit sugars. So going for an apple versus a candy bar is going to be a better choice.
So I just wanted to invite you guys to watch our Ducktalk recording that's on our website, prospernaturalhealth.com, it's all about blood sugar. So if this is an issue for you, please dive into it. We've got so much information there for you. So, and I wanted to talk about fatty acids and those omegas as another component here. So when we're thinking about our fatty acids, there's kind of two main pathways in the body that help make these good prostaglandins, these PGEs that you see there at the bottom. And those are anti-inflammatory chemicals, signaling chemicals in our body. So because we know that reducing neural inflammation is so important and providing the brain with these base materials for proper proper health, those EFAs are absolutely something to not look over. So we can get those from our seeds and our nuts, specifically our sesame seeds and our sunflower seeds for that linolenic acid side, and then the other side, the flax and pumpkin, help with some of the building blocks and the cofactors for the alpha linoleic acid side. We also see the marine lipids entering in there. You can see with those EPAs, and that's a direct way to get into that pathway. So we really do encourage fish oils for our non-vegan patients and our pescatarian patients that are happy to eat fish. We really love it when they're incorporating the marine lipids or krill oil into their supplement routine or diet to help with their brain health. So there are so many different types of fish oil out there. We just want to really encourage our patients to make sure that they're getting things that are clean and have been tested, to make sure there's not heavy metals or other chemical contaminations. There are capsules if you're somebody who doesn't like oils that are just in liquid form. The advantage to the liquid form is usually the cost is a little bit better for the quantity. One way to use those fish oils in a capsule form, if you do tend to burp from fish oils, would be to put them in the freezer and to take them frozen. And sometimes that can help them to get further down in that digestive tract. But these are some of our favorites. I want to point out here that DHA is one of the most critical building blocks for brain. And that's one that we really like to see shine in our EFA choice for our patients who are dealing with cognitive changes. When we're going for foods that are going to be these healthy fats, we're really thinking once again about those marine, so fish and seafood based proteins and oils coming from those whenever possible. We don't want to be cooking or heating those oils that we're supplementing in those forms for the fish oil, though, of course, because that will oxidize them. We also want to be thinking about making sure we're getting in oils that are coming from fruits. So we're thinking about avocado, coconut, and olive oil in particular being really good anti-inflammatory oils to be cooking with, and avoiding those seed oils that are going to be more pro-inflammatory and higher in those omega-9s. We also know that egg yolks in particular have chemicals in there that can be really helpful for brain health as well. So making sure you're having a wide variety of these healthy fats is going to be important. We've mentioned movement. We know that's critical for your oxygenation to the brain because it stimulates that movement throughout the body of the blood flow. And then we also know that it's going to be stimulating and giving signals to our cerebellum, which is just so important. We know that even as little children that play with things like balancing and things like that can help them with memory long term. So something that we often will have some of our memory patients work on are core building exercises that involve balancing. So even simple things like planks or working on basic sit-ups and things like that that strengthen the core can be very important for their cerebellum. And then we also know that movement helps neuroplasticity. We know that when we go on walks, we can choose to use a treadmill or we can choose to walk outside. Whenever we're having landscape go past us, that's actually important information for our brain, and that can help with our neuroplasticity. It also helps with our stress reduction whenever we're outside. Choosing nature walks and things like that, we know can lead to a deeper sense of stress reduction for people. And we're really, seeing that patients who are engaged in new learning activities it can really make a big impact on their brain because it's helping them make new neural connections. So that's challenging yourself maybe to a new style of exercise, new style of movement. Now we want it to be gentle and something that you're working with a trainer with, so that you're not hurting yourself, of course. But those kind of things can really make a long-term impact as far as our brain health. We see in the research, it's very clear that we have a reduction in so many problems when we add consistent movement into the day-to-day routine for a person. We know that it reduces our risk and development of dementia. We know that it helps with diabetes. So there's that blood sugar control piece. We know it helps with heart health. That's going to help with circulation, which is eventually potentially going to impact the brain. We know that it also helps with our mood. So if we can be getting our walks in at minimum every day, or another type of movement, if you have to have some other form of movement, swimming or some kind of gentle stretching, that can make a profound impact for you. Now we're going to get into sleep and why it's just absolutely critical.
Okay. So interestingly, we think of sleep as a very inactive state of being, but there's so many processes that are active while we're sleeping that can only happen while we're sleeping. And a lot of the regeneration and sort of cleaning processes that happen in the brain only happen during deep sleep. One of the things that happens while we're in deep sleep is growth hormone release. And growth hormone is a hormone that's really important for stimulating cell growth, reproduction, and regeneration. And it's been shown to support cognitive function. So that's one of the processes that are happening when we're snoozing. And then there's also this whole system called the lymphatic system within the brain. You may be familiar with the lymphatic system that exists in the rest of the body. And it's a group of vessels that exist alongside our blood vessels that bring fluids and waste back to the heart to then kind of eliminate it, essentially. And the lymphatic system is the brain's innate housekeeping cleaning system. So what happens is when we're in deep sleep, the main fluid in our brain, the cerebrospinal fluid, pulses and essentially washes debris, including those beta amyloid plaques that are involved in dementia formation, in Alzheimer's disease formation. And again, this only happens during deep sleep. So if there's anything that is preventing you from getting into your full sleep cycle, it's something we need to address to support your long-term brain function. So there's a number of these neurotransmitters and hormones that are really important for sleep. Melatonin is one of our main hormones that signals that it's that kind of enables our circadian rhythm that allows us to get to sleep. And this so it's produced throughout the day, and there's some precursors that we can include in our sleep support formulas like tryptophan and 5-HTP that will that we convert to serotonin, and then through a number of different processes eventually to melatonin. So interestingly, we're producing all of those hormones all day, even though we're using melatonin at night. So melatonin is something that's secreted from our pineal gland, which is at the base of our brain. And you'll see this pulsatile release at the end of the day, often stimulated from change in light patterns. So really helpful to pay attention to avoiding too much bright light before sleep. And really, we really want to support our body in having this um, regulated sleep response where our melatonin is rising at the appropriate time before bed. And when we're having a hard time with sleep, whether we're jet lagged or just get in a dysregulated sleep pattern, using melatonin in a supplement form can be really helpful for reestablishing our circadian rhythm. And we typically will dose that at 1 to 3 milligrams an hour before bedtime. So stress reduction can play a really big role in cognitive function over time. We know that corticosteroids, which are these stress hormones secreted from our adrenal glands, are produced during times of great stress, and they can they can cause hippocampal degeneration, so loss of neurons and change in our brain structure over time. And one of the ways that we often like to support patients through times of stress to reduce the rapid release of these stress hormones, and then the kind of crash that can occur after that rapid release that can make us really fatigued, is through adaptogenic herbs. So these are herbs that have been shown to, again, what we call modulate or kind of slow the release of those stress hormones, and allow for a sustained release of hormones like cortisol and epinephrine throughout the day to give us more sustained energy sources, and to dampen that stress response. So some of the main herbs that are in this category are some of our kind of traditional Chinese and Ayurvedic herbs. So that includes panax ginseng, that's red ginseng, that's in kind of the base of a lot of tonifying Chinese medicine formulas. We've got Siberian ginseng, also known as Eleutherococcus, that is native to Russia, and it is really great for being really stimulating, but also calming to the mind. So really good for improving exercise tolerance, but also helping us with that kind of wired, stressed brains that we can develop. Ashwagandha is another one that can be really calming. It is an Ayurvedic herb that is a tonic that is used for improving vitality, traditionally used in men, but now we find it appropriate for all of the genders, and really great for just kind of helping promote that sustained energy reserve. Rhodiola is one that's really useful for being a little more mentally stimulating when you're kind of having some issues with brain fog and fatigue in that way. And then lastly, we have holy basil or tulsi, really great calming adaptogen as well.
So we knew you guys would want to hear about different supplements as well, because that's such a common tool that we use in naturopathic medicine. And there are so many different supportives for the brain. And we want to just, of course, remind you that working with your health practitioner and figuring out what components might be a portion of the root cause if you are having brain changes and memory and cognition changes. So we wanted to take a moment and just recognize the power of magnesium. There are many forms of magnesium. They're very different. They do different things in the body, but magnesium can be an amazing one for the brain because it can address multiple different systems that can be involved. So we know magnesium as a base, we know it's critical for our bone health because it involves our calcium absorption of bone and how things are built for bone health. But we also know that it affects our sleep, it affects our muscles, and that can involve our pain pathways. So if we are in pain because we're having leg cramps or something like that, and that's disrupting our sleep, that's going to affect our brain health. And then we also know that it affects our cardiovascular system and our blood vessels. So it's in these different forms, like I was saying, magnesium threonate is the one that's recognized the most for neural tissues, and they have different dosing, so it's important to pay attention to that. Now, magnesium threonate, like I was saying, used for brain and cognitive things, we see that this helps a lot with people for things like headaches, and it can help with vascular flow. We also see magnesium citrate, which is used more for bowels, can be helpful when we have a gut-brain axis connection issue going on with maybe motility being involved and how our gut flora is regulated. Magnesium citramate is one that we'll use for people who are dealing with issues with energy and musculoskeletal problems. And we see magnesium glycinate being very easy on the intestinal system, but it is one that can be used for modulating our blood vessel expansion and also reducing things like our muscle cramps. So remember that blood vessel expansion is going to equal more oxygen getting to the brain, and we generally like that. So as far as neuroprotective substances, there are multiple different categories, and we could spend tons of time just on this slide alone. It's going to be here for you guys. The recording is going to be posted online, and you'll get the email of it, of course, too. But just to kind of break these down, we have our flavonoids, which are very critical antioxidants. These help reduce neural inflammation. That is a big deal. We cannot overstate how critical modulating inflammation for the brain is as far as reducing further impact of memory and cognitive changes goes. So within that, we have our sulforaphane that comes from the broccoli and cabbage family. It gets its whole slide here in a second because it's so important. We have turmeric, which has lots of great research on it as an anti-inflammatory. It, like sulforaphane, passes through the blood-brain barrier. That is very key. These antioxidants actually can transfer through that blood-brain barrier and work on those neural tissues. Resveratrol, which is found in grapes, often touted to be the reason that wine is so helpful, is also a great antioxidant. Quercetin, found in onion skins and onions, also known to be a flavonoid that can be neuroprotective. Then we have our mitochondrial support. Now remember, our mitochondria is the powerhouse for each of our cells. So it's going to affect the speed and the energy stores of the cellular communication. So when we're thinking about these, we have to put CoQ10 right at the top. L-carnitine, B2, riboflavin, B3, alpha lipoic acid, and magnesium all go within that critical components for mitochondrial support. For people who have methylation issues, that's usually along that B12 pathway and dealing with removing our oxidative stress components with free radicals. Methylation is a portion of that chemical cleanup, that biochemical cleanup. And we see things like our B12, our choline, and our riboflavin and our B5 star in those areas too. Now, as far as our essential fatty acids, we've touched on those today. Those omega-3s are so very important, but we need to supplement with them sometimes. We're not getting enough through our dietary intake. So that's really where that DHA is starring there, and EPAs can come in handy there too. We also have some others that we will sometimes give to patients if we find them to be deficient in different types of essential fatty acids. Phosphatidylserine deserves a little mention here because it's one that can help mitigate cortisol levels and also has been shown in multiple studies to be supportive of brain function. And it can be so beautiful to have that brain function restore for certain people and them to say, wow, my stress levels are better and I'm thinking clearer. Um, a, a medium chain triglyceride, so that's the NCT oil, that's been in the news a lot in the last 10 years, I'd say, and those can be really helpful for cognitive function as well. We see those beautiful adaptogenic herbs like ashwagandha come into play. And an herb called bacopa has been getting a lot of research behind it too. And that's been shown to help with cognitive function as well. So all of these can be neuroprotective and support the brain function depending on what's going on. We also know that these anti-inflammatories, like I was talking about, come in these phytochemical forms. So we've got turmeric as a big one here. We know there's good research on astragalus. Certain medicinal mushrooms like maitake and the beta glycan component of those mushrooms have been shown to be anti-inflammatory as phytochemicals. Licorice can play a role here too, though we have to be careful not to increase blood pressure in certain patients with it. And then lemon balm is a very mild herb that's also considered to be anti-inflammatory. Here's our wonderful little slide on these brassica family wonderful foods that contains these sulforaphane compounds. Taking sulforaphane alone as a supplement has been a really beautiful strategy for many of my patients, especially when we're dealing with that anti-inflammatory need because they have neural inflammation going on and getting that process to halt. So this can be a very powerful option for us. It's hard to get this dietarily because you're looking at several pounds ingested of broccoli seed, which is just not doable for most patients every day and would be kind of hard on their gut. So this truly is an extract, and it's kind of a use of a phytochemical in more of a pharmaceutical way. We're really looking at a little bit of a higher level intervention there with a very, very strong antioxidant. In fact, I think it remains our strongest antioxidant known to man at this time. So I want you guys to all remember, Dr. Mary and I really want to make this point that this is a multi-system approach that has to happen for brain. If we do just one of these things but neglect the others, we have problems down the line. So making sure you're going through this list and figuring out what might be impacting you, making sure you're sleeping, making sure you're well hydrated, well fed, making sure your stress is managed, looking at if you're getting enough movement, looking at if your hormones are balanced, and if you have the proper amount of antioxidants to come in to mitigate damage as it comes in. We also want to invite you with that, just so you know, we have a big library of doc talks that are recorded. So you can fast forward parts you might know already and spend extra time on those parts that might be really juicy information for you. And those are on our website. So feel free to take advantage of that. We have an entire one on sleep. We have an entire one on stress. We have an entire one on making sure that you're respirating and breathing well. Remember, that's part of that oxygenation piece. We have an entire one on hormones, and we've got an entire one on blood sugar too. So make sure that you're taking time to look at those pieces if they're helpful for you. Dr. Mary's going to share about Chinese medicine, and we're looking forward to that. So here she goes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Molly. So in addition to naturopathic medicine, I also have training in traditional Chinese medicine. And traditional Chinese medicine is an incredible system of thought and philosophy that's been developed over thousands of years, and includes many different. So it includes this whole system of understanding the body that's different from Western medicine, and can often be used really well, kind of alongside Western medicine to understand people and diseases in different ways. And it's given rise to a number of really amazing medical traditions, such as acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine, which is a very rich complex form of herbal medicine. So, within the Chinese medical system and philosophy and way of understanding the body, they've described physiological and mental function in the form of this organ system. And originally, the organs were described and sort of delineated prior to our sort of ability to sort of cut open bodies and hold organs in our hands. So they actually describe more kind of symbolic metaphorical systems, not just they're not always translated to the actual organ themselves, but they were translated when translating into English, they were translated into 5 major organs such as the heart and the liver and the lung and kidney and spleen. So when it comes to memory in the traditional Chinese medicine system, there's 3 major organs that are involved, and that's the spleen, the kidneys, and the heart. And one of the really interesting ways in which Chinese medicine differs from Western medicine is there's always this mental, emotional, and psychological component that's just completely integrated into the physiological understanding. And so when it comes to understanding memory within this system, there's 3 major types of memory, and each are associated with the mental, emotional component of these 3 different organs. So when it comes to memorizing facts, like studying and concentration, this is associated with the spleen and its components, kind of spirit, if you will, called the yi, which is responsible for our ability to make plans and enact practical the practical sort of nature of our day. So the spleen is the organ that's associated with digestion. So often when someone's, having constipation or diarrhea and a lack of motivation, this can go hand in hand with difficulty remembering facts and kind of keeping facts in one's brain. So often what we're doing is supporting the digestion along with mental function to kind of give someone the ability to absorb their nutrients and really kind of create the foundation for that mental function. So the next is remembering past events and facts, and this is associated with the jur or the will. And this is also associated with the kidney organ. Now, the kidney organ is responsible for development and growth and reproduction, and it's what we think of when we are talking about aging. So we often are wanting to tonify and support the Chinese medicine kidneys throughout the aging process to slow the aging process and to support someone's memory, particularly their long-term memory. And then lastly, we have learned action. So riding a bicycle or writing, the sort of physical kinesthetic memory. And this is associated with the heart and the shen. The shen is our kind of the mind and the spirit. And in order for us to kind of have a good sense of self and ability to interact with others and maintain our kind of physiological memory, the shen needs to be grounded in the heart. And that often involves, the blood is the Chinese medicine term that grounds the shen in the heart. And we want to support that through supporting digestion and giving us proper nutrients that we need to thrive. So that's kind of an example of how all of these organs act in concert with one another, and so all kind of support memory in different ways. So when we're talking about how to treat people within Chinese medicine, what we'll do is look at the individual in front of us and say, you know, given all of those different types of memory that can be compromised and different body systems that can be compromised, we look at you as an individual and many different aspects of your physiology and mental function to come up with a treatment plan. And within herbal medicine, we'll often have a formula that's very individualized to your needs and has up to, you know, anywhere between 3 and 20 different herbs in it. And so that's how we would kind of create an herbal formula. But specifically, there's some really interesting herbs and herbal extracts that have been traditionally used in Chinese medicine for memory support and can be involved in a lot of these memory support formulas. And ginkgo biloba is one that has been used within traditional Chinese medicine for over 1,000 years. And this one we use in both Western and Chinese medicine to support circulation to the brain. So it's a really great one. It's very often in herbal teas for memory support. We also have this extract called huperzine from this plant called Huperzia serrata, or also Chinese club moss. And research has shown that it acts as a reversible acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. It's a very long word, but this is basically describing the ways a class of pharmaceuticals that's used in Alzheimer's disease. So acetylcholine is one of our main neurotransmitters, and by slowing its breakdown, we can support neurological function over time. And this is a really interesting example of how Western medicine has elucidated the mechanisms of traditional Chinese medicine from this herb that's been used within traditional Chinese medicine for over 1,000 years. The other major form of treatment that I use at Prosper all the time is acupuncture, and it has been used in adjunctively for dementia support for a long time, and it's been shown to improve oxygenation and circulation to the brain, and also really largely works through stress reduction. As we were discussing before, our stress hormones and long-term stress response can really be involved in the pathogenesis of dementia. So this is one of the ways that it helps balance our organ systems and supports our brain function over time.
Thank you, Dr. Mary. So we want to invite you guys all to our next Doc Talk, which is going to be in June, and it's going to be on the second Tuesday of June. So it'll be June 14th, and it'll be on skin. We thought that the beginning of the height of summer may be a good time to talk about skin health and ways to optimize it and preventative care there. So please make sure to watch out for those registration emails when you get them. And then we want to, of course, answer any questions you guys might have today. So I don't see any actually on the chat, but if anyone has anything they want to add there, they're welcome to. And otherwise, we want to just invite you guys to make an appointment if you have questions that came up or want to dive deeper into what's going on either for yourself or for loved ones in regards to brain health and memory care. So thank you guys so much for spending extra long time with us today. We really love doing these, so thank you.